Hey guys, in today's episode I'm going to build a massive floating train station that sits about 50 meters above ground level and it's wedged pretty much into the side of a residential block. I've also made this pretty cool looking futuristic park on top of it, and at the end of this episode we have about 5,000 people living in this area. Alright, so let's zoom into where we're going to be working in this episode. It's been a while since I've built in Blackstar, probably about almost 2 months, and in those 2 months we've had some pretty cool stuff being released on the workshop. And a couple of those things are some pretty cool cyberpunk inspired buildings. And one of them in particular, from Jimbo West Coast, has these like platforms on it, and it got me inspired to get some verticality going on. Verticality, man, I am getting good at making up words. We are gonna start building up, and like seriously up. We go up about 150 meters by the end of this episode, directly above the train station. This is something that I've never really done before, and there was something I found on the workshop that was of vital importance that we'll get into during the episode. So you can see here, rather than using one building, I'm using 4, and we're going to link all of these together with pedestrian paths and sky walkways and all sorts of cool stuff. So those buildings now are exactly where I want them. I want to put the train station in here nice and early, and we're going to raise this up to about 50 meters above ground level. Now the reason I've done that is because most of the action in this area is going to be 50 meters above ground level. We are going to have a couple of really busy parks up in that area, as well as the majority of our residential housing. So as crazy as this may all look and sound, there is a somewhat method to the madness. I've also tried to place this entire residential block in an area where this train station isn't too close to any that we've already got existing in the city. I do fluff around for a while trying to get the placement of the station right, but eventually when I get to plumbing this in and hooking the tracks up to the original line, I want it placed so that citizens really use it, so that it's worth them getting on and going to the next station. So A, the stations need to be placed in really handy areas, and B, they can't be too close to one another or they're just going to walk. So putting the train line in here, I'm just using a vanilla one for now so I can see what I'm doing. This was the invisible floating one, but I'm actually going to do something different. But for now I leave them as those vanilla ones, just so I can see where they're at, check the curves and get the trains running. Next, it's time to get all of the pedestrian paths in. So you're actually going to see me run them pretty much everywhere over these buildings, but the method is I need to run one from the ground, so the road that these buildings are placed on, directly up to our train station level, and then I'm going to raise it up to the next level above that internally inside the buildings, and then we're going to go up to the final level with the same method inside the building. The only parts of these paths that I really want to be able to be visible is out on these big observation decks and out in front of the shop facades around the sides of these buildings. I used some Terra networks to get rid of the terrain underneath the train station. It's most certainly living up to its name of a floating train station now. And then I use this cool building here from Jimbo West Coast with this sort of hole or gap in it and put it around the train line. I think this looks really neat. Then I sort of just want to carry on in the area putting some of these more peripheral buildings in. Some of the platforms I'd like to look like they're floating, but others I don't mind if they look like they're sort of on top of apartment blocks or whatever. Most of the buildings that you're going to see me put in here are procedural objects, just so I can get them exactly the right size, but later on in the episode we go through and put plenty of normal type buildings in. And some of those buildings are obviously going to be well above ground level, so what I need to do is run some roads in and through here now, so that when I change the spawn point of those buildings with the spawn point mod, I've got a road underneath the building down on ground level, and this is going to be where I set the spawn point to. If anyone's not familiar with that mod, it's basically a mod that allows you to change the point where the services will go to a building if anything happens or it needs anything. So as you could imagine, this is a perfect mod for what I'm trying to do here. At this point, we've got all of the fundamental stuff in that we need to see if this is going to work. So the last thing I need to do is place these cube surfaces in and up on the paths, and then it's about giving it a bit of time and coming back and seeing if it's working. Well, unfortunately guys, it didn't work at all, so this is the end of the episode. Thanks so much for watching. Just kidding. Of course it's worked, and through the magic of editing, it even looks like the first time I got it right, which would be a massive lie. It took me about 3 or 4 times to get this all working right. But it is, and we can start detailing. And down here on ground level, it is no frills. I want this very much industrial. Lots of pipes, very brutal down here. We are saving the pretty stuff for much higher up. As much as I want to make this a really beautiful city, I also want it to be somewhat realistic, for a city on Kepler anyway. So these pipes, even though they might not be representing anything specific, I think it's important just to show a little bit of the underbelly of the city here and there. Not to mention, these also give an awesome contrast to the nicer areas. So when I say nicer areas, we're actually only going to include 1 or 2 nice areas in this entire residential block, because this is where I really want to start introducing some slum areas. But we're going to get into that a little bit later in the episode. For now, I'm working on this big floating park, and I'm experimenting with different methods for the train track that's going to go around the outer perimeter of it. I have a glass sort of pedestrian walkway thingy here that I'm trying to see if I can fit over the track. Ultimately it doesn't work, but this has been a good example of the entire process of this city so far. I do so many things more than once, and if they don't look right, I'm not afraid to just try something else. So along with that glass tube, I also experiment with just like a little thin pedestrian path, but in the end I settled for the actual station track that comes with Nardo's floating train. I don't believe the station track was made for any more than just the station, hence the name. But this just looks so good, and I think it looks just a little bit better than the train floating in the middle of nowhere. As much as the city is pretty, fictional, I think the floating train was just a little bit too sort of concept-y or fantastical. And it just looks a hell of a lot more relatable running on an actual track that we can see. It is not all smooth sailing, however it does come with its issues that we'll run into a bit later on. But for now, let's carry on with this floating park. I want to put down some surface networks here and start actually building the park area. I've used 2 different levels of surfaces here, about 20 meters apart, and my idea is to have the park on the roof of this structure. I'm going to build a glass facade that runs around the inside of the train track, so it kind of looks like that these 2 surfaces create a structure within them. This entire floating park that I'm building here was really inspired by this park I'm putting down here. I've managed to save this on Steam because it's very difficult to find. It's by a Chinese creator, and they have made a whole range of these types of decorative parks. I like this one here that I'm using for 2 reasons. 1, it's really colourful, and 2, it's got this sort of a nice semicircle shape that's going to fit our park pretty well. And this is going to be the nicest part of this residential block by far. It's going to be sort of the central park in the middle of everything. And of course with that it's going to be functional, so you see me running real pedestrian paths in here, and I also put a couple of entertainment cubes up here and then give it a bit of time to see if it works. This is where everything really starts to come together. I chose these buildings initially because they offered these big flat areas where I could build different sub-levels, and that's really what we're doing now. We're going to put surface networks down here where all these pedestrian paths are and start detailing all these areas up. And although I'm not going too crazy up on these levels, I do want every one of them to try and represent something a little bit different. So just as in a real city we have different types of neighborhoods with different types of citizens, we're going to try and do the same here, but in a very small sort of space. Some areas are going to be really wealthy and others are going to be really poor. But one overarching sort of vibe that I want to get through is that there's kind of this painted face on the city that sort of pretends that there isn't any people that are living in poverty. Maybe some of the more slummy areas are just covered up by huge neon billboards. Maybe the citizens are a little bit hardened and less empathetic towards those sort of less fortunate people because they walk by them every single day, and maybe they feel helpless themselves. Blackstar City is very much a machine that runs and will continue to run, whether there's people in poverty or people, more fortunate. That actually might be a better analogy of what I'm trying to explain here actually, is that the city is just a huge machine that's sort of designed to churn out a huge profit for a small amount of people. And I would imagine that there's actually citizens living here that realize that as well. But if you do realize that and you're aware of it, you've pretty much got two options. You either get on the Omega Project train and try and do well in the city, or you head out into the desert and do your best. So my entertainment cubes are working here, they're drawing people up to our floating park, but I've got a major problem. And you can see here that they don't work on floating or raised surfaces. All the people are back down on the ground. And I mentioned at the start of the episode that there was something in the workshop that pretty much made all of this area possible to build. And what that is floating parks. So basically it's an invisible park that I can raise up to any given level and people will go there on that level. And I know that was a terrible explanation, but for those of you that understood what I just said, you'll know how much of a game changer that is. This is huge. I had no idea this was in the workshop. And what I did to install this in our park was I plopped it down on the road on the ground, selected it with move it, and then aligned the heights with the path up on the floating park. And you can see here, once I moved it into that path, it's working perfectly. There's heaps of people chilling out up here now. And in the end, I've got a little wee skate park up here with a shop, a cafe, and some playgrounds for the kids. This level here is going to be the first of the slummy areas that I introduce. A lot of these shacks I've turned to PO to be able to reshape, but also some of them I've left as actual buildings. I would like it to look like up here that a lot of people are living in the actual building that we're building on, but because of the space offered by this little level, there's sort of shacks just built up here because of the need for housing. And the city just turns a blind eye because there's so many of them. It's not worth the time to try and police it and kick these people out because they just build new shacks somewhere else. So the rest of the citizens have just got to put up with these areas. They may walk past them every day, and maybe some of the citizens that live in these shacks are genuinely good people, but they've just been caught in, a really shitty environment. Either way, I think these shacks really represent or inject something different into a city that's very robotic and machine-like. For me, it just kind of makes me have a bit of empathy for the people that may live there. So we're on a bit of a roll here. Let's carry on with the next spot. We're going over to the floating train station and we're actually going to detail underneath it. I figured this would be quite a high traffic area and there might be a few shops around here, but there's also going to be a hell of a lot of advertising. This train station here eventually becomes one of the busiest in Blackstar, and I really just want to make this entire area look like a real hive of activity. Maybe if you have a business or if you're an advertiser, it costs a little bit more to get your advertisement in this area because of how much traffic is here. And not only do we build underneath it, but we also build on top of the train station, so it really looks like it's well and truly integrated into this entire block. And moving up to that next level, that's about 75 meters off the ground, I'm going to build the first Chinatown, or Japantown if you've played Cyberpunk 2077, in Blackstar. And I say the first one because we are definitely going to have more than one Chinatown. But I thought if I combine one of the levels here into a whole lot of Japanese themed shops, and then changed the roof of the train station into like a little wee Chinese park with a beautiful little pond and a bridge going over it, maybe that would be something people wouldn't necessarily expect from this area, which I think is perfect. I do, however, definitely need to brush up on my Japantown making skills. I don't think I pull this off very well at all. I think it's quite novel having it this high off the ground, but I'd like to come back to this and do it probably a little bit better in future. I'd also like to say really quickly, I hope I'm not offending anyone who might be Japanese and Chinese by mixing you guys up. I'm just completely ignorant, and yeah, I'm doing my best here. I certainly don't want to offend anyone though. But if there's anybody out there who could give me some pointers on maybe how to make this a little bit more realistic, please hit me up in the comments. It'd be more than welcome. But with my limited knowledge, I'm just trying to make this as pretty as I can. I got some pretty nice looking assets that are appropriate of the workshop, and I've run a real pedestrian path in here with a cube service, or one of those floating parks I should say, to draw citizens in here. And although I may not have pulled this off as well as I would have liked, I think it definitely adds some variation and something a little bit different to our residential block here than just sort of plugging this with the same old prop commercial buildings and shacks. So let's move up to the top level here and start building the final part of our residential block. If you happen to be a wealthy businesswoman or man living within the city, this is probably where you would call home. I guess you could picture this area as sort of the penthouse suite of this whole sort of block. There's virtually no advertising up here. There's beautiful sort of social or common areas with lakes and trees, and the housing is very, very sophisticated. And of course the views from up here are pretty unparalleled across the city. Initially I didn't really like the idea of having any utopian or beautiful areas within the city. I kind of wanted to make it all quite grungy, but in the end this seems like such a natural thing to do up on a platform like this. Plus, there's got to be at least one part of the city where, the Omega group or the people within that group live, and it would be a pretty nice area, you would imagine. So for this area here, I wanted to make this sort of utopian looking building, and because the construction of it is reasonably involved, it's much simpler to build it out here next to the city on a piece of terrain. It's just simpler. I don't get caught up with other props and things that are underneath what I've built, and when we're done, we just copy and paste it over where I want it on that top platform. And I want a nice white curvy building here. We're going to make this look really sort of utopian styles, and I've actually blown up one of the hyperloop rings from Nardo to create that ring around the roof of these structures. And then we're going to put like a green space on the top with a real pedestrian path around so people can come up here and walk around. So you guys heard me mention Nardo earlier. I just want to give a quick shout out to Nardo and a couple of other asset creators at the moment that are just pumping out some amazing cyberpunk or futuristic style assets. Number one is a chap named Cyberglum. Number two is Disto Guy. Number 3 is Cash, and number 4 is Electrotech, and you guys might know Electrotech. He makes videos on YouTube as well. But between the 4 of these people, they have made some amazing stuff recently for Cities Skylines, sci-fi and cyberpunk style cities. So I have to spend some time giving them a shout out. Check the link in the description of the video if you guys want to go have a look at my sci-fi collection, which includes many assets and stuff from these said creators. I've spent a fair amount of time just staring at this area since I've built it, which generally means I'm pretty happy with it. There's just heaps going on here and it looks really cool. We've also managed to create a pretty diverse area with slums, lots of middle class housing, and that utopian style area on the top for the really wealthy folks in the city. In the next episode we build something very unique, and it's fair to say I am feeling the sci-fi buzz again, so I'm going to do a little bit of a run on this series. So thank you guys so much for watching the video today. It really means a lot to me and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Sometimes I struggle to put into words my gratitude, but basically the reason I make these videos is because you guys are interested, the viewers. And again, I appreciate every single one of you guys. Have yourselves an excellent weekend guys, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you on the next episode. Peace.